August 1944, Normandy, France. The Allied invasion was failing in the French countryside, and everyone knew it. This is the story of General Guy Simonds, the Canadian commander who became the one Allied general that German officers privately admitted they feared more than all others. 6 weeks had passed since D-Day, and the Great Escape from the beaches had turned into a nightmare. British and Canadian forces were stuck fighting around the city of Caen, trapped in a brutal battle that killed 2,000 men every single week. They weren't moving forward. They weren't winning. Every day brought more death for a few hundred yards of destroyed farmland. American troops faced the same horror in the hedgerow country to the west, where every field hid German machine guns and every road became a killing zone. The Allied advance was measured in yards, not miles. German defenders were killing 3 Allied soldiers for every German casualty. Generals were starting to whisper the word nobody wanted to say out loud: stalemate. The top commanders all agreed on one thing. Real leadership came from experience. Every successful Allied general had commanded troops in the trenches of World War I. Montgomery had fought at the Somme. Patton had led tanks in France in 1918. Bradley had trained officers for decades. They had earned their authority through years of combat, working their way up through the ranks the proper way. The British Army especially valued this tradition. Officers came from the right families, attended the right schools, and learned warfare through a system that went back centuries. Combat experience was everything. That's what everyone believed. Then there was Lieutenant General Guy Simonds of the Canadian Second Corps. He was 41 years old. He had never commanded troops in real combat before 1943. He came from a middle-class family with no military background. His father was a British immigrant who had struggled to make money. Simonds himself was cold, distant, and almost robotic in how he thought about tactical problems. He inspired respect, but never affection. His own officers found him scary. Montgomery thought he was brilliant, but too difficult to work with. British staff officers made fun of him behind his back. They called him a mathematical soldier with no feeling for real men. American generals barely knew his name. They were too busy building their own fame to notice a Canadian commander. Even Canadian soldiers complained that Simonds treated them like pieces on a chessboard. He would calculate how many men had to die to achieve a goal, then order the attack without showing any emotion. One officer said it plainly. He would sacrifice a battalion to save a division without blinking an eye. But Simonds saw something the other generals missed. While everyone blamed the hedgerows, blamed German defenses, blamed the weather and the terrain, Simonds identified the real problem. Allied forces were fighting a World War II battlefield using World War I tactics. Infantry advanced behind artillery barrages, exactly like they had at the Somme in 1916. Tanks moved slowly behind the infantry to provide support instead of charging ahead to break through enemy lines. Commanders always attacked during daylight when German anti-tank guns could see clearly and pick off Allied armor with ease. On July 18th, during an operation called Atlantic, Simonds watched his units get slaughtered in a daylight assault against a hill called Vera-Riz Ridge. The Germans held the high ground with carefully positioned anti-tank guns, mortars, and machine gun nests. They could see everything. Canadian infantry and tanks advanced across open wheat fields in the middle of the afternoon, and the Germans destroyed them with cold efficiency. The Black Watch Regiment went into battle with 325 men. 324 died or were wounded. Only one man walked away unhurt. Tank losses were over 50%. Burning metal hulls littered the wheat fields like tombstones. That night, Simons sat in his headquarters tent, staring at casualty reports by lamplight. The numbers were horrific. The waste of life was staggering. But worse than the casualties was the fact that they had gained nothing. The Germans still held the ridge. All those men had died for a few hundred yards of scorched earth that would probably be lost again tomorrow. Other generals would have blamed bad luck, or asked for more artillery support, or waited for reinforcements. Simons did none of these things. Instead, he drafted a proposal that would change how modern armies fight. His insight was brutally simple, but completely revolutionary. Stop attacking when the enemy can see you. The idea seemed obvious once he said it out loud, but nobody had actually done it before. Not at this scale. Not with hundreds of tanks and thousands of men. Night attacks were considered impossible with armored vehicles. Tanks couldn't navigate in darkness. Units would get lost. Soldiers would shoot at each other by mistake. Coordination would fall apart. Every military manual said the same thing. Armor fights in daylight. Simons didn't care what the manual said. He had watched too many men die following those manuals. He had seen German tank guns destroy Canadian tanks from a mile away, because they attacked at noon when visibility was perfect. He had watched German artillery observers on hilltops call down fire on advancing infantry, because they could see every movement in broad daylight. The German advantage wasn't better equipment or better soldiers. It was simply that they could see Allied attacks coming from miles away and prepare accordingly. What if they couldn't see? What if 700 tanks rolled forward through complete darkness under a new moon? What if heavy bombers dropped thousands of tons of explosives on German positions minutes before the armor arrived, with the bombing timed so precisely that tanks would drive through the smoke and chaos before defenders could recover? What if infantry rode inside armored vehicles instead of walking behind them, protected from the machine gun fire that had killed so many? It would be the most complicated military operation ever attempted. It would require perfect timing across hundreds of vehicles. It would demand new equipment that didn't exist yet. It would need navigation systems that had never been tested. And it would have to work the first time, because there wouldn't be a second chance. Simons began writing out the technical specifications. He didn't know yet if anyone would approve his plan. He didn't know if it was even possible. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The old way of fighting was killing thousands of men for nothing. Something had to change. And if the change cost him his career, that was a price worth paying. Within days, Simons called his plan Operation Totalize, and it would be history's first major nighttime armored assault. The technical specifications were unlike anything attempted before. 720 tanks and armored vehicles would advance in 4 parallel columns through the darkness. Each column would be exactly 200 yards wide. The vehicles would navigate by compass bearing, and tracer fire streaking overhead like deadly fireworks. The attack would begin at 11:30 at night under a new moon, when darkness would be almost complete. Minutes before the armor rolled forward, 120 heavy bombers would carpet bomb German positions, dropping explosives so thick that the earth itself would shake. But infantry couldn't walk behind tanks at night. They would get lost in the darkness and separated from their armor. Machine gun fire would cut them down just like always. Simons needed a way to protect his infantry while they advanced, and the solution came from an unexpected source. He ordered his engineers to take M7 Priest self-propelled guns and remove their main weapons, the big 105 WWII guns that stuck out the front. What remained was an armored box on tracks with room inside for a dozen infantrymen. Simons called them kangaroos, and they were the first purpose-built armored personnel carriers in military history. He demanded 76 of them built in 6 days. His engineers thought he was crazy, but they started cutting and welding immediately. The biggest technical challenge was navigation. How do you move 7-20 armored vehicles in tight formation through complete darkness without headlights? One vehicle getting lost could crash into another, creating chaos. Simons developed multiple backup systems that all had to work together perfectly. Radio directional beacons would be placed every 1,000 yards along the route of advance. Colored tracer fire would mark the boundaries of each column, red on one side and green on the other. Tank commanders would update their compass bearings every 500 yards. Bofors anti-aircraft guns would fire on fixed lines every 10 minutes, their bright flashes serving as reference points that crews could navigate toward. Tank crews trained for 72 hours straight on night driving procedures, learning to move in formation without any lights while keeping exact distances from the vehicles around them. Montgomery's chief of staff read Simons's proposal and called it fantastically complicated and impossibly risky. British armor commanders argued that tanks simply couldn't fight effectively at night. Visibility would be under 50 yards. Coordination would collapse within minutes. Units would fire on each other in the confusion and darkness. The whole attack would turn into a disaster. Simons's own staff warned him that concentrated bomber strikes risked hitting Allied forces if the timing was off by even a few minutes. One brigade commander looked him in the eye and said bluntly that this plan would be a catastrophe that would destroy the Canadian Corps. But Major General George Kitching, commanding the 4th Canadian Armored Division, backed Simons without reservation. Kitching understood the math of the Normandy campaign. Conventional tactics meant conventional casualties. The Canadian Army was losing 300 men every single day using daylight attacks. They were running out of replacements. Every week brought fresh graves and fewer trained soldiers. Kitching told his skeptical officers the truth they didn't want to hear. Simons's plan might lose 300 men in one terrible night, but it might also break through German lines and end the stalemate. The old way was guaranteed to keep killing Canadians at the same rate forever until there were no Canadians left to send forward. August 7th, 1944, the 11:30 at night. The night was moonless and dark as ink. 720 armored vehicles began rolling forward through wheat fields that were still smoking and burning from the bombing raid. 120 bombers had just dropped 4 at 62 tons of high explosives on German positions. The earth was torn open in massive craters. Trees were shattered into splinters. Buildings were flattened into rubble. Fires burned everywhere, casting strange flickering shadows. German defenders were caught completely unprepared. They expected attacks at dawn like always. That's when armies fought. That's what every battle in Normandy had taught them. They were sleeping in their dugouts and bunkers when the bombs fell. They were still trying to figure out what was happening when Canadian tanks appeared out of the darkness like metal ghosts. The first warning many German soldiers had was the sound of diesel engines roaring past their positions. By the time they grabbed their weapons and climbed out of their shelters, the first wave of Canadian armor was already a mile beyond them. Driving deeper into German territory, the navigation systems worked exactly as Simonds had planned. Tank commanders watched the colored tracer fire marking their boundaries. They listened for the Bofors guns firing their reference shots. They checked their compasses every few minutes and adjusted course. The columns stayed tight and organized, even though drivers could barely see the vehicle in front of them. It was like watching a massive machine operate in darkness, 700 pieces moving together with precision. Phase 1 objectives were 6 miles deep into German lines. Previous operations had taken 3 weeks to advance 6 miles. Simons's force captured those objectives by 2:30 in the morning, 4 hours after the attack began. Canadian units were farther forward than anyone had dared to hope. The casualties were 1/3 of what had been expected. 1/3. That meant 2 out of every 3 men who would have died in a daylight attack were still alive. German commanders couldn't organize counterattacks because they didn't know where the Canadian spearheads were. Radio reports from forward units were confused and contradictory. Some positions reported being overrun. Others reported seeing nothing. German officers couldn't send their reserve tanks forward because they might drive straight into Canadian guns in the darkness. The Wehrmacht's careful defensive system, which had stopped every previous Allied attack, simply fell apart when attacked at night. The results were mathematically dramatic and undeniable. German prisoners were captured in the first 6 hours. 11 German tanks were destroyed. The Canadians lost 18 tanks, which sounds like a lot until you compare it to previous battles where Canadians lost 50 or 60 tanks to destroy 11 German ones. The kill ratio had completely reversed. The 89th German Infantry Division ceased to exist as a fighting unit. It was simply destroyed, scattered, captured, or killed. Most importantly, Simonds had proved that nighttime armor tactics worked at massive scale. This wasn't a small raid or a limited experiment. This was an entire corps. Thousands of vehicles and men executing a complex operation in complete darkness and succeeding beyond expectations. Every manual that said it was impossible was now proven wrong. Every general who said tanks couldn't fight at night had to reconsider everything they thought they knew. The attack penetrated further in 3 hours than previous operations had managed in 3 weeks. The casualty rate dropped by 75%, while the advance rate increased by 400%. Simonds had found the answer written in blood and mathematics. Stop attacking when the enemy can see you. When morning came and staff officers compiled the final reports, the before and after statistics were impossible to ignore. Previous Canadian operations in Normandy had gained 2.3 miles per week, while losing 340 soldiers for every mile captured. Operation Totalize gained 6 miles in 18 hours, while losing only 85 casualties per mile. The casualty rate dropped by 75%. The advance rate increased by 400%. These weren't small improvements. These were numbers that changed everything about how modern war could be fought. German intelligence reports captured weeks later revealed something even more significant than the tactical success. The psychological impact on German commanders was severe. An after-action report from the 12th SS Panzer Division stated clearly that the night attack by massed armor was completely unexpected. Forward positions were overrun before defensive fire could be organized. Then came the sentence that revealed everything. This Canadian commander understands armored warfare better than any British or American general we have faced. The report was classified, meant only for German eyes. It wasn't propaganda or exaggeration. It was a professional military assessment, and it named Simons as the most dangerous opponent they had encountered. SS General Kurt Meyer, who commanded one of Germany's most elite divisions against Simons, wrote about him years later in his memoir. Meyer was known as Panzer Meyer, a legend in the Wehrmacht, a commander who had fought across Europe and faced the best the Allies could send against him. His words about Simons were chilling in their respect. Simons was the most dangerous opponent I encountered. He was ice-cold, calculating, and willing to accept losses that would have paralyzed British commanders. He studied our defensive tactics and systematically developed counters. Fighting him was like playing chess against someone who thought 3 moves ahead. The Wehrmacht began circulating specific warnings about Simons's corpse to all units facing Canadian forces. No other Allied formation received this treatment. Not Patton's Third Army, not Montgomery's 21st Army Group, only Canadian Second Corps under Simons. German standing orders emphasized that Canadian Second Corps attacks may occur at any hour, especially at night. Forward positions must maintain 50% alert status continuously. The Germans were so afraid of another night attack that they kept half their soldiers awake around the clock, which exhausted units and reduced combat effectiveness even when no attack came. By September, Simons had expanded his tactical innovations across multiple operations. The Battle of the Scheldt was his masterpiece of combined arms warfare. The mission was to clear German forces from the approaches to Antwerp port. Without Antwerp, the Allies couldn't supply their armies deep in Europe. But the approaches were protected by water, flooded fields, and heavily fortified German positions on both sides of the Scheldt estuary. British commanders looked at the problem and said it would take months and cost tens of thousands of casualties. Simons planned an amphibious assault across the Scheldt estuary using waterproof tanks and tracked amphibious vehicles called buffaloes. The operation involved 3,000 vehicles crossing once 200 yards of tidal water under German artillery fire. British commanders declared it impossible. The tidal currents were too strong. The vehicles would sink or be swept out to sea. German guns on both shores would destroy anything that tried to cross. Every conventional military analysis said the operation couldn't succeed. Simons launched the attack anyway on October 26th. The sensory reality of his operations was brutal and unforgettable. Canadian soldiers remembered the deafening roar of diesel engines echoing across dark water, hundreds of vehicles churning through cold October waves, the sharp smoke of burning oil mixed with the salt spray, and the sharp chemical smell of cordite from exploding shells. Tracer fire arced overhead in long red and green streaks, beautiful and deadly at the same time. German artillery shells sent up white plumes of water when they missed and orange fireballs when they hit. The strange thing was the disorientation, soldiers said later. Navigating by colored tracer fire in darkness while your vehicle pitched and rolled in tidal currents felt like being in a nightmare where nothing stayed still and death could come from any direction. Inside the Kangaroo armored personnel carriers, infantrymen sat shoulder to shoulder in complete darkness. They couldn't see anything. They could only feel every lurch and bounce transmitted through the armor plating. They could hear the engine roaring and the treads clanking, and sometimes the sharp metallic ping of small arms fire hitting the exterior. They knew that German anti-tank rounds that would have killed them instantly in open trucks now sparked harmlessly off the steel walls around them. The psychological effect was strange. Being inside armor was terrifying and reassuring at the same time. You couldn't see death coming, but you also couldn't be touched by machine gun fire that had killed so many of their friends in previous battles. While Patton's breakout grabbed headlines across America, his third army racing across France in August, it was Simons's grinding battles that actually destroyed German armor reserves. American newspapers ran huge stories about Patton covering 300 miles in 30 days. His face was on magazine covers. His quotes about blood and guts were repeated everywhere. But military historians later understood the real story. Operation Totalize destroyed elements of 6 German divisions. Operation Tractable, Simons's follow-up attack on August 14th, used the same night attack principles to close the Falaise Gap, trapping 50,000 German soldiers in a pocket where they were killed or captured. Without Simons's operations fixing German armor in place and destroying panzer reserves, Patton's tanks would have faced coordinated counterattacks from fresh German divisions, instead of scattered resistance from exhausted remnants. Yet recognition and fame completely eluded Simons. American newspapers wanted heroes who looked good in photographs and said quotable things. Patton wore ivory, handled pistols, and gave speeches about how Americans love a winner and will not tolerate a loser. That was great copy. That sold newspapers. British press celebrated Montgomery's strategic brilliance and his careful, methodical approach that fit the British self-image. Simons received one paragraph in most Allied news releases, usually buried on page 8. The Canadian public barely knew his name. His cold personality made him completely unmarketable compared to colorful Americans or aristocratic British commanders. One war correspondent explained it simply: Patton was great copy. He had pistols, profanity, and bravado. He said outrageous things that made good headlines. Simons gave precise casualty ratios and tactical assessments in a flat voice. He explained operations using mathematics and statistics. Guess which one sold newspapers? German commanders never forgot him, though. In interviews conducted after the war ended, Wehrmacht generals consistently rated Simons as the most tactically competent Allied corps commander in Northwest Europe. General Heinrich Eberbach had commanded Panzer Group West before being captured. He knew armor warfare as well as anyone alive. His assessment was devastating for other Allied commanders. If the Allies had 6 generals like Simons, the war would have ended in 1944. He understood that victory requires ruthless calculations, not inspiring speeches. Most generals want to be loved by their men. Simons wanted to bring his men home alive, even if they hated him for how he did it. By war's end, the statistics told the real story that newspapers missed. Canadian 2nd Corps under Simons had advanced further into German territory, captured more ground, and inflicted more German casualties than any comparable Allied formation. Most importantly, they did this while suffering below average losses per mile gained. Those numbers represented thousands of Canadian soldiers who survived the war and went home to their families, instead of dying in French wheat fields. Simons's innovations didn't die when the war ended. They became military doctrine studied and copied by armies worldwide. His Kangaroo armored personnel carriers directly inspired every modern APC that came after. The American M115, which carried soldiers through Vietnam and a dozen other wars, was based on Simons's design. The Soviet BTR series that equipped Warsaw Pact armies for decades followed the same basic concept. The Israeli Merkava tank designed in the 1970s included a rear compartment for infantry because Israeli generals had studied Simons's operations and understood that infantry and armor must move together under protection. Every modern mechanized army in the world uses armored personnel carriers as standard equipment, and they all trace back to those 76 kangaroos that Simons's engineers welded together in 6 desperate days in August 1944. His nighttime armored tactics became required study at every major military academy. West Point taught Operation Totalize as the definitive example of tactical innovation under pressure. Sandhurst analyzed his navigation systems and coordination methods. The Soviet Franz Academy translated his operational plans and made them required reading for officers commanding tank divisions. The Israeli Defense Forces adopted his principles wholesale after studying how he won battles. Israeli doctrine emphasized concentrating armor at unexpected points, attacking at unexpected times, and accepting calculated risks to minimize overall casualties. These were pure Simons, filtered through a different army fighting different enemies, but following the same cold mathematical logic. After the war ended, Simons rose to the highest positions in Canadian military leadership. He became Chief of the General Staff of the Canadian Army from 1951 to 1955, the top Army position in Canada. Then he became Chairman of the Chiefs of Staff Committee, which made him the senior military advisor to the Canadian government, a position he held until 1960. He modernized Canadian forces to NATO standards during the Cold War. He introduced helicopter assault tactics years before the Americans used them in Vietnam. He established Canada's professional military education system that trained officers in systematic, tactical thinking rather than just traditional leadership. Everything he touched became more efficient, more professional, more focused on results rather than tradition. Yet, despite holding Canada's highest military positions for nearly a decade, he remained virtually unknown to the Canadian public. There were no Hollywood films about the icy Canadian general who terrified the Germans. There were no best-selling memoirs with dramatic stories and colorful language. There were no ticker-tape parades or monuments in city squares. Simons simply did his job, retired quietly, and faded from public memory, while Patton and Montgomery became household names that everyone recognized. When Simons died in May 1974, his obituary in the New York Times ran exactly 6 sentences. 6 sentences for a general who had commanded corps-level operations across Northwest Europe, and then led an entire nation's military through the Cold War. When Patton died in 1945, he received 3 full columns of coverage. When Montgomery died in 1976, the Times gave him a full page with photographs and detailed analysis of his career. The general that German officers feared most received less recognition than lieutenants, who had better publicists and more dramatic personalities. The contrast reveals something profound and uncomfortable about military leadership and public memory. Patton's boldness was photogenic. He looked good on camera. His quotes were memorable and dramatic. Simons's cold calculations were not photogenic. Nobody wants to watch a general explaining casualty ratios and navigation systems. Montgomery's aristocratic confidence played beautifully in newsreels. His clipped British accent and neat uniform made him look like central casting's idea of a general. Simons's icy competence didn't play well anywhere. He looked uncomfortable in photographs. He spoke in precise technical language that bored reporters. He had no talent for self-promotion and no interest in developing one. Americans wanted heroes who embodied national character. Patton represented aggressive individualism, the bold cowboy who shoots first and asks questions later. Bradley represented modest professionalism, the quiet, competent officer who gets the job done without drama. Both fit American self-image perfectly. Canadians weren't entirely sure what they wanted their heroes to look like, and Simons certainly didn't match whatever image they had in mind. He was too cold, too calculating, too willing to spend lives like currency to achieve objectives. That kind of ruthless competence made people uncomfortable, even when it saved more lives in the long run. But effectiveness and popularity are completely different measurements, and Simons achieved what military commanders are actually supposed to achieve: mission success with minimum casualties. Those are the only two things that matter in war. His corps suffered 30% fewer casualties per objective captured than comparable British or American formations. 30%. Those statistics represent thousands of soldiers who came home to their families instead of dying in French fields or Dutch towns. Those men got to see their children grow up. They got to grow old with their wives. They got to live full lives because a cold, calculating general treated them like valuable resources to be conserved rather than brave heroes to be spent freely. The lesson extends far beyond World War II and military history. The most effective leaders often aren't the most celebrated. Real innovation comes from cold analysis and systematic thinking, not inspiring rhetoric and dramatic gestures. Simons saw warfare as a mathematical problem requiring systematic solutions. Exactly that mindset makes bureaucracies uncomfortable because it challenges established traditions and questions comfortable assumptions. But that same mindset wins battles and saves lives. Professional organizations resist people like Simons because they make traditional leaders look bad by comparison. It's easier to celebrate the general who gives inspiring speeches than to promote the general who reduces casualty rates through boring logistics and careful planning. Today's military professionals study Simons's operations in detail at staff colleges worldwide. The 1991 Gulf War used night attacks by armored forces as a central strategy, directly applying principles Simons established in 1944. American tanks and armored vehicles advanced through darkness using GPS navigation and night vision equipment. But the operational concept was pure Simons. Attack when the enemy can't see you. Modern combined arms doctrine, which integrates armor, infantry, artillery, and air support into coordinated operations, follows patterns he established 80 years ago. Every time a modern army conducts a major offensive operation, they're using tactics and principles that Simons developed while other generals were still thinking about World War I. Perhaps the deepest irony of Simons's story is that he earned exactly what he valued most, not fame or affection or public recognition. He earned professional respect and tangible results. German generals who fought against him understood his achievement, even if newspapers didn't care. Those German assessments, written for internal use, with no reason to exaggerate or flatter, prove more significant than any parade or medal. When your enemies fear you above all others, when they study your methods and warn their troops, specifically about you, when they rate you as the most dangerous opponent they faced, That's the ultimate professional recognition. Fear is the tribute that professionals pay to excellence. Simons earned that tribute through cold calculation, systematic innovation, and ruthless focus on the only mission that mattered: winning battles while bringing his soldiers home alive.